Hello, my name is Alex Iles, and in today's episode we're going to be looking at some of the native British gods that were also worshipped by the Romans along Hadrian's Wall. Welcome back. It's great to have you here. We're going to be looking at some of the native gods along Hadrian's Wall and some of the unknown deities as well that exist within the native British pantheon. But the best way to start off is to actually start off by thinking about the fact of what was the native British religion like. So in a previous episode, we looked at the imported gods on Hadrian's Wall, so ones that had come from Germanic or Gaulish backgrounds. And many people think, because of the fact that the word Celtic is used often, they bundle in together the Gauls, Spanish, British, Irish, all together as a Celtic milieu, all together as a single group, that somehow all of these deities were interconnected and worshipped across the whole of that area, and all of the Celtic peoples worship the same gods. But we don't actually know that. We think that through international trade there may have been mixing, and so because of that we know that gods were introduced into the British Isles from the Romans, but at the same time there would have been gods that would have been shared across the whole of the Celtic or the sort of the Western European pantheon that was in existence at that time. And so when you have those shared deities, maybe they would have had slightly different names, slightly different aspects in different places, but they would have still shared some ideas. Interestingly enough, across northern Britain, there are 120 Romano-Celtic, as they've been described, deities that are unique to northern Britain. And when you've got those unique northern British gods, they've then been worshipped up here in the region, and they probably started off as just small little tribal gods or gods of a location. The big issue is that the Britons don't seem to have a written form that we can recognize. Unless they had a writing form that was written on wood and it's all rotted away, we just don't have any idea of what the previous Britain's religious system was before the Romans arrived. So because of that, every god that we encounter is influenced through a Roman lens. And so what could have happened is that maybe the Romans come along and they find a location where the Britons are worshipping, or they're making votive offerings or sacrificing into pools of water, or they're gathering at a sacred grove or locations like that. And so what they do is they go, this place is important to the Britons, why not we give the local spirit a name, or that they find some significance and they name it. And so when we encounter a shrine set up by a Roman, we then go, well, that was the name of the god as worshipped by the Britons. But we're not entirely certain. Did these gods or locations or places even have names as we understand them, or were they ideas or feelings or things like that? So that when the Romans come along, they can then go, okay, that feeling there, or that concept that you have, we'll combine it with Sylvanus, the god of the wild, or we'll combine it with Mars, god of war, or we'll combine it with Minerva, goddess of wisdom. And so because of that, then they evolve from that. And we have the names of deities that we recognize. So like down in Bath, so for instance, down in Bath, Sulis is combined with Minerva to create the cult of Sulis Minerva. And so that's a good example there of a native British deity that is then paired with a Roman deity to create a cult that we recognize today, and we can see icons and altars and things like that dedicated to Sulis Minerva. So what we'll do now is we'll look at the first of the deities, and we'll look at Brigantea. Right here we have Brigantea. Now Brigantea is mentioned in a number of inscriptions and altars around northern Britain, and she is the personified deity of the tribe the Brigantes, which was a huge confederacy that stretched across much of northern England and had a lot of control, and was actually an allied tribe to the Romans at various points after the Roman invasion under their queen Cartmandua. So when you've got that, they were pro-Roman. Later on there is a civil war caused by the queen of the Brigantes, Cartmandua, divorcing her husband Venutius and marrying his shield bearer, but alongside that as well, it's underpinned by the fact that she is pro-Roman, he is anti-Roman. He may have been a prince from one of the allied tribes, possibly the Carveti of Cumbria, and then from that he had anti-Roman sentiment. There were other issues as well, such as the fact that she handed over Kokodacus, the British guerrilla leader, to the Romans, which then caused her tribe to revolt against her, and she was then rescued by the Romans sending in a strike force into Brigantia's territory, and she was taken down to Chesters, where she's basically stayed the rest of her life. But from there, the Romans then conquered up northern Britain until the 80s AD, when much of northern Britain and parts of Scotland were subjugated by the Romans, and then later on the Romans had to pull back between the Tyne and the Solway, creating the frontier that would remain until the end of Roman Britain. Now, very interestingly enough, Brigantia, when she's depicted, she could have been depicted very similarly to Britannia. Now, Britannia in many Roman coins is depicted subjugated or conquered by the Romans. So, for instance, some depictions of her are shown with her hair being pulled by a Roman soldier or things like that. And she is shown as subservient to the Romans or captured. In other ones, you have depictions of emperors with like Gaul, Britannia, and Germania depicted as slaves following on behind the emperor. And there's depictions like that. So when you have these depictions, Brigantia could have been depicted in the same way. But whenever she's depicted, she's actually depicted in the same style as Minerva, which is really interesting. So right here we have one from Byron's in Scotland on the Antonine frontier. And this is the one where we have an inscription of her name alongside her actual image as well. So this is how we know that the Romans or the Romano-British saw Brigantia. When you have her, she's paired with Minerva. She's holding a spear. In hand, she's holding a globe, which again was associated with Minerva. And she's depicted as a warrior goddess, which is really interesting again, because these people, in theory, were people who had revolted against the Romans, so their goddess might have been subverted by Roman power, and when they'd subverted that Roman power, they may have depicted her as a slave or as a conquered goddess to Roman power, but instead, they actually pair her with Minerva, and they show her as a sort of powerful female figure, which again shows an interesting one as we understand how these native gods could become a part of the Roman system. So with Brigantia right here, we have her depictions, and we know she's worshipped through northern Britain. This is a recent discovery of an image of Brigantia from South Shields Roman fort or Arbea Roman fort. And when you have a depiction of her, you can see there are similarities with the crown on her head and the depiction, which would be very similar to the depiction of Minerva within the Roman system. Then on the far side, we have an altar which is dedicated to both Brigantia and Jupiter Dolichanes. So it's a 3rd century altar from Corbridge, and so you can see that Brigantia, this deity of the northern English, or the area would eventually become northern England, is then also being worshipped side by side with Jupiter Dolichanes, who is obviously a god who is combining Jupiter, the greatest and the best, and with also Dolichanes, who is a Syrian or a southern Turkish deity, to create this sort of new cult within the Roman Empire, which was sponsored by the Severans. And because the Severans are coming up to northern Britain to do campaigns against what is now the region of Scotland, they would have then brought that with them. But this person who has dedicated the altar has chosen to also put Brigantia in there as well. So we have a state-sponsored cult of Jupiter Dolichanes being combined with a native deity, which shows that she's equally as important. So it's not that these native deities are less than the Roman deities, they're actually just adopted at the same time, and they're seen as just as important and powerful. There is also a possibility that the Brigantes were created by the Romans, because sometimes the Romans would try and bring together groups of barbarians and basically create royal dynasties so that they could pay money to a single group of people, have that influence in a single area, and then those native tribes would then project their power so that the Romans only had to deal with one local leader. And we see this sometimes across in Germany, we see this in Britain, and also in northern Britain later on when the Picts appear. Many archaeologists and historians now seem to think that the Romans basically started creating the Picts and the Mani by giving gifts to certain tribal leaders, so it was easier and less messy to deal with the area which would later on become Scotland. So there's a possibility the Brigantes are similar, and therefore sponsoring the cult of Brigantia might actually have helped, because when you're sponsoring her cult, the native people go, that's our goddess, and so we can focus in on that, and we can create a united cultural identity around Brigantia. So there's a possibility of that as well. How native is she? Is she a Roman created goddess based off a single tribe? Or is she actually the goddess of the area that the Romans adopt to keep peace and power in northern Britain? So an interesting one there. We also know that there's a huge amount of troops, and it's estimated possibly up to 22,000 troops stationed in northern England during the Roman period. And to give you an idea, the whole of Gaul is estimated to have around 6,000 troops. So when you're combining that together, the possibility of a militaristic female deity of the tribe, who then the Roman soldiers would have been able to focus on, with 22,000 estimated soldiers up in the region, it would have gone down over the course of the empire as troops were taken away for usurpers and wars and losses and stuff like that. But Brigantea may have been very useful for that, to actually bring together Roman power around this central cult. So I hope you've enjoyed looking at Brigantea, but what we'll do next is we'll move on to the next deity, Kokodacus. So the next deity to look at would be Kokodacus. Now Kokodacus is a native deity who is worshipped more on the western side of Hadrian's Wall. And he seems to have had a cult centre in Oswald's Roman fort. So when he had this cult centre, he seems to have been very important to the local Roman soldiers, and there's a number of altars and dedications to Kokodacus. When he's dedicated to that area, he's normally represented in a very similar style. So over here, this is one of the styles that we definitely know is Kokodacus. You can see in one hand he holds a spear, in the other hand he holds his shield, and he's wearing armour. Just so you know, those aren't letters, that's a part of the carving. They think that shows folds in his tunic. That was found in the headquarters building of the Roman fort at Castle in Cumbria. So he's important and he's venerated into the late Roman period by Roman troops on Hadrian's Wall. So an interesting one there, that he becomes so important he's continued to be venerated into the late period. On the other side, these do not have inscriptions with them. They follow a similar style to the previous representation. So right here, you can see a figure. He's holding a spear in one hand and a shield in the other. And then finally, we have this one from Otterburn. Now this is thought to be Kokodacus as well, but again, no inscription. And it's a wonderful little depiction because we have the figure standing there with the shield in one hand and the spear in the other, almost with them raised above his head in victory. And so that is understood possibly with the understanding that this is Kokodacus, that this could be Kokodacus as well. Though some people have suggested it could be Beltocardos, but we'll come to Beltocardos later. So with Kokodacus, it's very interesting as well because he's a native god who is then adopted by the Romans, and then he is paired with different Roman deities. So when he's paired with different Roman deities, in the western part of Hadrian's Wall, he is paired with Mars. Whereas on the eastern end of Hadrian's Wall, he is paired with Silvanus. Now this is a very interesting one here as well, because the dedications in the western part of the wall are done by normal soldiers. And normal soldiers are worshipping often Kokodacus as a god, and the inscriptions are a lot more crude, they're a lot less fancy than other depictions you see in other parts of Hadrian's Wall, and so it's believed that Kokodacus may have been venerated by soldiers on the western side as a war deity and as a protecting deity in a similar to the way Mars is depicted, and in my video about Mars you can see that quite clearly. But in the eastern part of the wall, there are more dedications by officers to Kokodacus, and he is depicted with Silvanus, the hunting deity. So it's possible that the commanders, rather than venerating him as a version of Mars, are venerating him as a landscape deity, as a god of the land, and as a hunting deity to give them good luck with their blood sports and the enjoyment that they have with hunting around the northern British frontier. And so again, we can see a split there where the god is venerated by the needs of the people who need them. So this native British deity is taken, and he probably already had maybe a war aspect through the previous northern British or Celtic understanding and the need for warfare between tribes, and you would venerate him with that. Or it could be the fact that he is paired with Mars because the soldiers already venerate Mars, but they also venerate him because he's the native local god, the local aspect of Mars in their minds. Whereas when the officers and the commanders come through, they see Kokodacus as a landscape god. He is the local native deity. So what you do is you worship him as an aspect of the landscape, like Sylvanus. And so because of that, when they're worshipping him, he is for hunting instead. And I find that really interesting again, that a native god's purpose by the invading Romans would depend entirely on what they needed at that time. So what we'll do now is we'll move on to the next deity, Beltocardos. As you can see right here, question mark, Beltocardos. What and who is Beltocardos? Again, we have inscriptions from Housestead's Roman fort and other locations along Hadrian's Wall dedicated to Beltocardos. And again, he's paired a lot with Mars and he's worshipped by soldiers. But we do not have any depictions of Beltocardos from Hadrian's Wall. So because of that, who is he? What did he look like? What did they think of him? We just have a name, Beltocardos. And Beltocardos is this deity who is seen as important to the Roman soldiers on Hadrian's Wall. So there's a big question there as well. What was this native deity like? And so many of the native deities that we have from the Hadrian's Wall region don't have depictions. So we have to sort of guess what they would be like and maybe think about those aspects as well. Some people have suggested amongst academics that Beltocardos may be a horned deity because there are some depictions which don't have names or inscriptions next to them of horned deities throughout the British Isles and also in Gaul. And so they suggest that Beltocardos may have been one of these horned deities. But again, because there's no depiction of Beltocardos and he's paired with Mars, we're not entirely certain. So the soldiers, when they're worshipping this native deity, may have seen him as the regional version of Mars and just have seen him in the same way Mars would be depicted, but maybe more native. So it's a big question there as well. When we have these gods, just because we've got a name doesn't know what they look like before the Romans arrived, and how the native Britons interacted with this new version of Beltocardos the Romans recreated, where they pair him with having Mars Beltocardos or other deities like that. So I thought I'd include him because even though we don't have an image and it's a big question mark for us, it's still a really good question. Who is Beltocardos and what is he like for the Roman soldiers? And we'll move on now to our final deity, Antenaciticus, who I have done a video on before, but I just wanted to talk about a little bit more. So now, this is Antenaciticus. I have a video on his temple in Benwell if you'd like to go back and watch that. But Antenaciticus is a really interesting one as well, because again, he is found in Benwell in what is now the west end of Newcastle, up here in the northeast of England. He is shown as a youthful figure, so he's got a very youthful face. Obviously he doesn't have facial hair. He has these diamond-shaped eyes, and alongside this thick hair that is brushed forwards across his face. Some people have interpreted it that he has horns and he is a horned deity. Again, going back to what we said before about Kokodacus and Beltocardos possibly being horned deities, people interpret this thing on his head here as horns coming off, and so he could have been a nature deity similar to Sylvanus or other nature gods as well. But other than his name, we know very little about him. There's 2 shrines within his temple dedicated to him, one by a centurion of the 20th and the other by Tinius Longinus, who is a prefect of the auxiliary cavalry at Benwell. So he's got quite high status people within the region worshipping him, and he's got a temple built for him as well. So this is a native god who the Romans are adopting, and he could have been a local god of a spring or a local god of a bit of woodlands that the natives are depicting, and so they want him on side so that he's going to look after their troops. Now recently at Binchester Roman Fort in County Durham, another head was discovered. So the archaeologist who discovered it said, well, here is another depiction of Antenaciticus up here in the north of Britain. So it's another interesting one right there, because they look at it and they see some similarities between the 2 heads. So if I just move over here, you can look at it, you can see the thick hair on top of their heads, the shape of the eyes, the facial features. They thought, is this another depiction of Antenaciticus? Now, when they say, is this another depiction of Antenaciticus, that's quite an interesting one as well, because if it is, does that mean that the soldiers are then worshipping Antenaciticus in a number of different locations? Or is it a possibility that the native British gods are depicted like this? So if this is a depiction of a native British god, What this could be is that the fact that when they're carving these images of the native British gods, they have a number of blanks. They create the blanks and they say this is a native British god, and then they ship it out to the cult temple or the religious site, and then they say, right, you can put this one up here, and this is the god of this spring, this wood, this area of location, and you can pray to him in the Roman style. And so there's a possibility that there is that crossover between the two of them. That having been said, though, there are a number of differences, and in one of the academic journals I was reading, something was pointed out that I found really interesting, because this head was actually discovered in a bathhouse in a very late third or fourth century context. So when it's discovered in this 4th century context, the Romans in bathhouses would often depict bathhouse attendants, or in Rome themselves, the bathhouse attendants were black Africans. Now, when they were black Africans, that was because of the exotic nature that was associated with black Africans within the Roman mindset. And so the possibility is that at this bathhouse, this actual head here could be a depiction of a black African. And so there is that sort of link back to the bathhouses in Rome, the idea of maybe sensuality, the idea of exoticness, all combined together into a bathhouse. And so this could be a Roman depiction, because there are a number of Roman depictions of black Africans, and it fits within that sort of style because the eyes are more almond rather than diamond shaped with this one of Antenaciticus here. And so again, is this a possibility that this is actually a black African, and within the bathhouses they're wanting to show off that foreign and exotic nature within the bathhouses, or is it a native British god? I'm starting to weigh more towards the idea that this actually could be a black African rather than it being a native depiction because of the slight differences between the two heads. But again, in the comments section, I'd love to know what you think and your thoughts on that one as well, because there is plenty to discuss right here, and it's a really interesting one to look at as well. So we'll now look at the final section where we'll look at some other things that were discovered but haven't been identified yet as deities within northern Britain. So on the far side, we've got a frog deity, then we've got a warrior deity, and then finally over here, we've got a head, which has got a wonderful moustache on it. So these are 4 unnamed possible deity statues that have been discovered within the region of Hadrian's Wall. So the frog deity, there's also been some found at Binchester. These have been associated with places of water, but we have no name for this frog. So it could be a local spirit or a frog deity right there, and there's an interesting one too. Or it could be also a toad, who knows? There's not much difference between the two types of creature, but we have a small altar which would have been dedicated and put up maybe for health or well-being to this one here. Then we have this warrior deity here. He's naked. You can just see his genitals just between his legs, and he's holding his spear pointed downwards and his shield in the other hand. Could this be Beltocardos? Could this be Kokodacus again? We don't know. With these, again, maybe there will be more information that comes out when we can do scans of these and see if there's any paint left on them, because there's been a lot of research recently that basically these Roman altars, these Roman statues, they weren't just left like this, they were painted. And so when you imagine them painted, if it was painted red, that could be Kokodacus, because Koko actually means red, and so he was the red one. Something that I forgot to mention earlier on, but now I've mentioned now. So Kokodacus as the red deity, if this was painted red, then it could be Kokodacus. And then finally, right over here, we've got this wonderful head, which again could be a god, it could be a portrait of an individual. Again, the image of the dying Gaul is quite a famous one. And when you've got the image of the dying Gaul, he's got a wonderful moustache. And so when you think of the moustache here, we can see this as well. So is this something of a pan-Celtic depiction? So again, when we've got this pan-Celtic, is this also shared by the Britons? Is this Britain here, a moustached Briton, or is it a Gaul? Or is it someone else? Is it a self-portrait of a Roman, but in the later period it's cruder? So much questions right here, but could this be another native god? Is it another depiction of Kokodacus or Beltocardos? Or is it one of the Gaulish gods who I mentioned in the Gaulish gods episode, which has then been depicted up here on the northern frontier? So many of these questions can only come out through research, because when we do the research, we can then compare these statues to other finds, compare them and go, right, what are the key characteristics of these gods that we can then put onto this statue and go, yeah, we can narrow it down to this group of deities. And so that's the amazing thing as well. When we're looking at these, there's so many more questions that we have to look at and understand. So I'm really excited about that. As we look more and more at these, more and more knowledge will be developed, more and more theories as to the person and the characteristics of these deities, and we learn more about the native British gods and what people were putting importance on when they were venerating these deities up here on the northern frontier. So I hope you've enjoyed that question. Put some ideas down in the comment section, and I'd love to have a chat with you there and just see what your thoughts are about that too. So in conclusion, I really hope you've enjoyed looking at some of these gods, with Brigantea, who has received a second life during the Roman period, to Kokodacus, the red one, the warrior deity, who's paired with Mars and Silvanus, depending on what's needed at the time within the Roman frontier, Beltocardos, who we don't know what he looks like, to Antenaciticus, who is a native god who's adopted by Romans and is given quite a bit of power and may also be represented in other locations in northern Britain, to finally some of the unknown gods who we don't know who they are, but they may be discovered as we do more research. So I really hope you've enjoyed this episode. If you have done, please do like and subscribe, share it with your friends, write a comment below, let's get some talking going on down there. And if you'd like to support me further, I also have a Patreon as well, which you can use to support me if you like. As always though, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you'll join me for another video in the near future. Until then though, stay safe and well, and thank you so much.